What happens when a broken man receives salvation from the very person he was taught to fear most? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Ezra Thorne, though most folks around these parts know me as Deadeye, or at least they used to. Tonight, as I write this by candlelight with hands that barely shake anymore, I reckon it's time to tell the truth about what happened in Tombstone that October evening in 1887, about how I fell lower than a snake's belly and how salvation came from the last place I ever expected. The rain was hammering the dusty streets something fierce that night when I pushed through the batwing doors of McCreary's Saloon. The familiar smell of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and unwashed bodies should have been comforting, but nothing was comforting anymore. Not since my reputation started crumbling like a house of cards in a windstorm. "Well, well, look what the storm blew in," Bartus McCreary called out from behind the bar, his voice dripping with the kind of false cheer that makes a man's skin crawl. If it ain't the famous Deadeye Thorne. The way he said famous made it clear what he really meant. I was famous, all right, famous for missing 3 shots in a row during my last gunfight, famous for the tremor in my hands that got worse every day, famous for being a washed-up has-been who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if he was standing inside it. I slouched up to the bar, my spurs jangling with each unsteady step. The other patrons, miners, cowboys, and drifters, all turned to stare. Some whispered behind their hands, others just shook their heads and looked away. "Whiskey," I muttered, slapping a coin on the scarred wooden surface. "The good stuff." McCreary eyed the coin, then looked back at me with barely concealed disgust. "That there's a nickel, Thorne. Good whiskey costs 2 bits. Heat rushed to my face. I fumbled in my pockets, knowing full well they were emptier than a preacher's promise. "I'm good for it, Bartus. You know I am. Do I?" He leaned forward, his breath reeking of onions and cheap tobacco. "Last I heard, you couldn't even afford to feed that sorry excuse for a horse you ride. Word is, you've been sleeping in haylofts and begging for scraps." The saloon had gone quiet now, save for the drumming of rain on the roof. Every eye was on me, watching to see how far the mighty Deadeye Thorne had fallen. My hand instinctively moved toward my Colt, but the weight of it felt foreign now, like a tool I'd forgotten how to use. "Now see here," I started, my voice cracking embarrassingly. "I've spent more money in this establishment than any man in Tombstone. I deserve some respect." That's when Jeremiah Patterson, they called him Bull on account of his size and temperament, stood up from his table in the corner. Bull was the kind of man who enjoyed other people's misery the way most folks enjoy apple pie. "Respect?" Bull's laughter was like gravel in a tin can. "You want respect, old man? How about you earn it? How about you show us that famous quick draw that made you so feared?" The crowd murmured with anticipation. I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool October air. My hands started their familiar tremor, and I clenched them into fists. "I don't need to prove nothing to nobody," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Come on, Deadeye," another voice called out. "Show us what you got left." Bull stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over me. "Tell you what, Thorne, you outdraw me, and McCreary here gives you all the whiskey you can drink. You lose." He grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "You crawl out of here on your hands and knees like the broken-down dog you've become." I should have walked away. Lord knows I should have swallowed my pride and headed for the door. But pride is a funny thing. Sometimes it's all a man has left, even when it's fool's pride. "You're on," I heard myself say. We stepped into the center of the saloon. The crowd formed a circle around us, their faces eager for blood sport. Bull's hand hovered over his pistol with the confidence of a man who knew he'd already won. "On 3, McCreary called out. 1, 2. I went for my gun on 2, hoping to catch Bull off guard. It was a cheat's move, the desperate gambit of a man with nothing left to lose, but my hand betrayed me. The tremor made my fingers fumble with the grip, and the Colt slipped clattering to the floor. The saloon erupted in laughter. Bull hadn't even drawn his weapon. "Look at that!" someone shouted. "Deadeye can't even hold his own gun!" I dropped to my knees, scrambling for the pistol, but Bull's boot came down hard on my wrist. Pain shot up my arm like lightning. "A deal's a deal, Thorn," Bull said, pressing down harder. "Time to crawl." The humiliation was complete. Every eye in that saloon watched as I crawled toward the door on my hands and knees, my gun still lying on the floor behind me. The laughter followed me like a pack of wolves, each chuckle and snicker another nail in the coffin of my reputation. I pushed through the batwing doors and out into the storm. The rain hit me like a physical blow, soaking through my worn coat in seconds. Behind me, I could hear them still laughing, still talking about the pathetic spectacle I'd made of myself. Thunder crashed overhead as I stumbled down the muddy street. I had nowhere to go, no money for a room, no friends willing to take me in. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. That's when I slipped in the mud and went down hard, my head striking something solid. Stars exploded behind my eyes, and warm blood mixed with the cold rain on my face. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The darkness was creeping in from the edges of my vision. As I lay there in the mud, listening to the storm rage around me, I thought about my life, about all the men I'd killed, all the bridges I'd burned, all the chances I'd squandered. This was how it would end, I realized. Not in a blaze of glory like I'd always imagined, but alone in the mud like a mangy dog. But just as the darkness was about to claim me completely, I heard something that made no sense at all. Footsteps. Someone was coming through the storm, coming toward me. Who in their right mind would be out in weather like this? And more importantly, what did they want with a broken-down gunslinger who wasn't worth the powder to blow him to hell? Chapter 2. When consciousness returned to me, it came in pieces like a puzzle being assembled in the dark. First, there was warmth, blessed, unexpected warmth that seemed impossible after nearly freezing to death in that storm. Second, there was the smell of herbs and wood smoke, unfamiliar but oddly comforting. Third, and most confusing of all, there was the sound of someone moving about quietly, as if trying not to wake me. I kept my eyes closed and tried to make sense of my situation. I was lying on something soft, softer than anything I'd experienced in months. A blanket covered me, and beneath it I could feel that someone had removed my wet clothes. That should have alarmed me, but I was too weak to do much more than catalogue the details. "I know you are awake," a voice said softly. A woman's voice, speaking English with an accent I couldn't quite place. Your breathing changed. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to see the familiar rough-hewn walls of some settler's cabin. Instead, I found myself staring at a ceiling made of wooden poles and what looked like animal hide stretched between them. Strange symbols were painted on the leather in colors that seemed to shift in the firelight. "Where am I?" I croaked, my throat raw and dry. "Safe," came the simple reply. I turned my head toward the voice and felt my world shift on its axis. The woman kneeling beside me was unlike any I'd ever seen in Tombstone or any other frontier town. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, her long black hair braided with small bones and beads. She wore a dress made of soft doeskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the firelight. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. Dark as midnight, but with a depth that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. She was Apache. Every instinct I'd developed over 35 years of frontier living screamed at me to reach for my gun, to get as far away from this woman as possible. Apache were killers, savages who tortured their enemies and left settlers scalped and mutilated. Every story I'd ever heard about them was a tale of horror and bloodshed. But my gun was nowhere to be seen, and I was weaker than a newborn calf. More confusing still, this woman had clearly been caring for me. A bowl of what looked like medicine sat nearby, along with clean cloths and fresh water. "You're Apache," I said, not quite managing to keep the accusation out of my voice. Her expression didn't change. "I am Ayana, And you are Ezra Thorne, the gunfighter who cannot shoot." The words hit me like a slap. Even here in this strange place, my reputation had preceded me. "How do you know my name?" "People talk, stories travel." She dipped a cloth in the water and wrung it out. "Even to those who live outside your towns." She reached toward my forehead, and I flinched away instinctively. She paused, her hand suspended in the air between us. "I mean you no harm," she said quietly. "You have a wound that needs tending." I wanted to refuse her help, to maintain some shred of dignity and self-reliance, but the truth was, I needed her. Without her intervention, I would have died in that storm. The irony wasn't lost on me, saved by the very people I'd been taught to fear and hate. Reluctantly, I nodded. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned the wound on my forehead. Her hands were steady and sure, nothing like my own trembling fingers. "Why?" I asked after a long moment. "Why help me?" She continued her work in silence for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she sat back on her heels and met my eyes. "Because no one should die alone in the mud," she said simply. There was something in her voice, a pain that echoed my own. It occurred to me then that she was alone out here, living in what appeared to be a small, isolated cabin. Where were the rest of her people? Apache lived in groups, in villages. They didn't live alone. "Where's your tribe?" I asked. Her hand stilled for just a moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Hurt, perhaps, or shame. "I have no tribe," she said, resuming her work with the bandage. "What do you mean? Every Apache has a tribe?" "Not every Apache." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the pain underneath. "Some of us are cast out." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Cast out, exiled, rejected by her own people, just as I'd been rejected by mine. The parallel was too obvious to ignore, and it made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite explain. "What did you do?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was none of my business, and given that she'd just saved my life, I had no right to pry. But she surprised me by answering. "I refused to marry the man my father chose. I was stubborn, willful. I brought shame to my family by running away on the day of the ceremony." She finished tying the bandage and sat back. "In my tribe, a woman who shames her family in such a way is no longer welcome." I stared at her, trying to process this information. In my experience, Apache women were either victims to be rescued or threats to be eliminated. I'd never considered that they might have their own struggles, their own reasons for defying their people. "So you live out here alone?" "For 3 years now." She moved to tend the fire, adding another piece of wood. "I built this place with my own hands. I hunt, I gather, I survive." The respect in my voice surprised even me. "That can't be easy." "No," she agreed, "but it is better than living a lie." We fell into silence after that. I watched her move around the small cabin with efficient grace, and I found myself studying the details of her sanctuary. The walls were lined with herbs hanging in bundles to dry. Animal pelts were stretched on frames, and tools I didn't recognize hung from wooden pegs. Everything was clean and organized, a testament to her skill and determination. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but the rain still drummed steadily on the roof. I should have been planning my escape, figuring out how to get back to town and reclaim what was left of my life. Instead, I found myself oddly reluctant to leave this warm, quiet place. "Your clothes are drying by the fire," Ayana said, breaking the silence. "You should rest. You lost much blood, much." "I need to get back to town," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wondered what exactly I was going back to. No money, no reputation, no friends, just more humiliation and slow starvation. "In the morning," she said firmly. "Tonight, you rest." She moved to the far side of the cabin and began preparing what looked like a bed for herself on the floor. It occurred to me that she was giving up her own bed for a stranger, and not just any stranger, but a white man who represented everything her people had been fighting against. "Why are you really doing this?" I asked. She paused in her preparations and looked at me across the flickering firelight. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Perhaps," she said finally, "because we are not so different, you and I, both cast out, both alone, both trying to survive in a world that has no place for us." Her words hit closer to home than I cared to admit, but before I could respond, she had turned away and settled into her makeshift bed, signaling that the conversation was over. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to the dying storm and the soft sound of her breathing, I found myself facing an uncomfortable truth. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I felt curious about this woman who had saved me, about her story, about what had really driven her from her people. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt wanted, not feared, not respected, not even tolerated, just wanted, needed perhaps, in the same way that I needed her. It was a dangerous feeling, and I knew it. Because come morning I would have to leave this place and return to the world that had already written me off as a failure. The question was, would I be able to walk away from the one person who had shown me kindness when I needed it most? And what would happen if I couldn't? Chapter 3. Dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls like a hesitant visitor, and with it came the reality of what I had to face. I'd spent the night in the home of an Apache woman, something that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours ago. More troubling still was the fact that I'd slept better than I had in months. Ayana was already awake, moving quietly around the cabin as she prepared what smelled like some kind of herbal tea. My clothes hung near the fire, dry but still bearing the stains of my humiliation from the night before. "Your fever broke during the night," she said without turning around. "That is good. The wound was deeper than it appeared." I sat up slowly, testing my strength. The world spun slightly, but I felt more human than I had in weeks. "I need to thank you properly for saving my life." She handed me a cup of the steaming liquid. It tasted bitter but warming. "No thanks are needed. It is what anyone would do." "No," I said firmly. "It's not what anyone would do. Most folks would have left me to die in that mud. Especially—" I paused, suddenly aware of how my next words might sound. "Especially an Apache," she finished for me, raising an eyebrow. "You may speak plainly, Ezra Thorne. I am not easily offended." The way she said my name, with no trace of mockery or judgment, made something tighten in my chest. When was the last time someone had spoken to me with simple respect? "I've done things," I said quietly, staring into the cup. "Things I'm not proud of, things involving your people." She was quiet for a long moment, and when I looked up I found her studying me with those penetrating dark eyes. "Tell me," she said simply. I wanted to refuse, to keep my shame buried where it belonged. But something about this place, about her presence, made confession feel possible, maybe even necessary. 7 years ago, I was riding with a cavalry unit as a scout. We were tracking a band of warriors who had raided a settlement near Fort Apache. The words felt like gravel in my throat. We found their camp at dawn, women and children sleeping in their wickiups. Ayana's expression didn't change, but I saw her hands tighten slightly around her own cup. The lieutenant said they were all hostiles, said they were harboring the raiders. I didn't question it. I was young, angry about something else entirely, and I needed the money. I took a shaky breath. "We killed them all, every last one. Men, women, children who had probably never seen a raid in their lives." The silence that followed felt heavy as lead. I waited for her to order me out, to curse me, to do something that would justify the guilt I'd been carrying ever since. Instead, she asked, "What changed?" "What?" "Something changed in you after that day. I can see it in your eyes." "What was it?" I was taken aback by her perception. There was a little girl. Couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. She was hiding behind her mother's body when we found her. She looked up at me with these huge, terrified eyes, and my voice broke. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pull that trigger. But someone else did. Yeah, someone else did. I set down the cup with trembling hands. I left the cavalry after that, became a gunfighter, told myself I was only killing men who deserved it. But I was really just running from what I'd done. Ayana stood and moved to the window, looking out at the morning landscape. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than angry. My grandmother used to say that a man's worst actions do not define him unless he chooses to let them. She believed that redemption was always possible, but only for those brave enough to face their own darkness. And what do you believe? Do you? She turned back to me, and I was surprised to see something that might have been hope in her expression. I believe that you have been facing your darkness for 7 years. The question is, what will you do with the pain now? Before I could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Ayana stiffened, moving quickly to peer through a gap in the wall. "Soldiers," she said quietly, "3 of them, coming this way." My blood ran cold. If they found me here, with her, it would mean trouble for both of us. White men didn't socialize with Apache women, especially not notorious gunfighters who were supposed to be afraid of nothing. "There's a root cellar," Ayana whispered urgently, "behind the back wall. You can hide there until they leave." But as she moved toward the concealed entrance, I found myself standing up instead. The motion sent pain shooting through my head, but I ignored it. "No," I said, "I'm done hiding. Ezra, you don't understand. If they find you here with me, then I'll deal with the consequences." I reached for my gun belt, then remembered it wasn't there. "Where's my weapon?" She hesitated, then pointed to a wooden chest in the corner. I cleaned and oiled it. The leather was damaged by the rain, but the gun itself is still sound. As I strapped on the familiar weight of my Colt, I caught sight of something that made me pause. There, hanging from a peg near her bed, was a cavalry sword. The brass was tarnished but well maintained, and carved into the wooden grip was a name, Lieutenant James Morrison. "Whose sword is that?" I asked, though something in my gut already knew the answer. Ayana's face went pale. "It belonged to my husband." "Your husband was cavalry?" "Was." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He died 3 years ago, the same week I left my tribe." The pieces were starting to come together in my mind, forming a picture I didn't want to see. "Ayana, what really happened? Why did you leave your people?" The sound of horses was getting closer. We could hear voices now, harsh and commanding. But Ayana looked at me with an expression of such profound sadness that I forgot all about the approaching soldiers. "I did not leave because I refused an arranged marriage," she said quietly. "I left because I discovered my husband, the white soldier I loved and married in secret, had been killed by warriors from my own tribe. When I confronted my father about it, when I demanded justice for James's death, they called me a traitor to my people. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. You were married to a white man. For 2 years. We met when he was stationed near our territory. He was different from other soldiers. Kind, respectful. He learned our language, our customs. He even gave up his commission to avoid fighting my people." Tears glistened in her eyes, but some of the young warriors saw our marriage as an insult. They ambushed him while he was hunting alone. "And your tribe protected them." "My tribe said he was an enemy soldier who deserved to die. They said I was foolish to mourn him. When I refused to accept their judgment, when I kept demanding they punish his killers, they gave me a choice: renounce my love for him and marry the man they had chosen, or leave forever." The sound of approaching voices was almost at the door now. But I couldn't move, couldn't think about anything except the pain in this woman's eyes and the impossible courage it must have taken to choose exile over betraying her heart. "Ayana," I started, but she held up a hand to silence me. "Someone's in there," a voice shouted from outside. "I can see smoke from the chimney." "Army patrol," another voice called. "Open up in the name of the United States government." Ayana looked at me with desperate eyes. "Please, Ezra, if they find us together, they will assume the worst. They will hurt you, and they will kill me." For a moment I wavered. The smart thing would be to hide, to let her handle this alone, to preserve what little remained of my reputation. But as I looked at this woman who had sacrificed everything for love, who had saved my life without asking for anything in return, I knew I couldn't abandon her now. "We'll face them together," I said, checking the cylinder of my Colt. My hands were steady for the first time in months. She stared at me in amazement. "You would risk everything for me? After knowing me for less than a day?" "Didati, sometimes a day is enough," I said, moving toward the door. "Sometimes a day can change everything." But as I reached for the door handle, ready to face whatever consequences awaited us, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Thorn!" A familiar voice bellowed from outside. "Ezra Thorn! We know you're in there, you Indian-loving son of a bitch!" It was Bull Patterson's voice, but Bull wasn't a soldier, which meant this wasn't just a routine patrol that had stumbled upon us. They had come looking for me specifically, and they had brought the army with them. The question was, how had they known where to find me? Chapter 4. The pounding on the door came like thunder, each blow shaking the entire cabin. Through the gaps in the wood, I could see at least 5 men, more than Ayanna had initially spotted. Bull Patterson was there, along with what looked like 2 actual cavalry soldiers and a couple of men I recognized as his usual drinking companions from the saloon. "We ain't got all day, Thorn." Bull's voice carried the ugly satisfaction of a man who thought he had his prey cornered. "Come out here and face what's coming to you." Ayanna moved to my side, her face pale but determined. "There is another way out," she whispered. "Through the back. You can still escape." I looked down at her, this remarkable woman who had shown me more kindness in one night than I'd received in years, and felt something shift inside me. The old Ezra would have taken that escape route without a second thought. Self-preservation had been my guiding principle for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand for something greater than my own survival. "No more running," I said quietly. "It's time I faced my choices." Before she could protest, I called out toward the door. "I'm coming out, Bull!" "But these soldiers better know what they're getting themselves into." I checked my gun one more time, noting with grim satisfaction that my hands remained steady. Whatever else had happened to me, whatever I'd lost, I was still Ezra Thorn, and some skills never truly leave a man. As I reached for the door latch, Ayanna caught my arm. "Wait, there is something you must know." "Ayanna, there's no time." "My husband's sword, the one you saw, Lieutenant James Morrison." Her eyes were urgent, desperate. "He was not just any cavalry officer. He was the one who refused to participate in the massacre you told me about." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" 7 years ago, at the camp near Fort Apache, James told me about a scout who tried to stop the killing, a man who couldn't bring himself to murder a child. He said that man saved his faith in humanity. My legs nearly gave out. "He talked about me? He said he spent years looking for you. He wanted to thank you for proving that not all white men were monsters. He wanted to tell you that your conscience in that terrible moment mattered more than all the killing that came before." The irony was so overwhelming, I could barely breathe. The woman who had saved my life was the widow of the one man who had understood my burden. The one person who might have offered me forgiveness had been murdered by the very people I'd wronged. "Thorn." Bull's voice was getting angrier. "You got 10 seconds before we come in shooting." I looked at Ayanna one more time, memorizing her face. "Thank you," I said simply, "for everything." Then I threw open the door and stepped out into the morning light. Bull Patterson stood in the center of the clearing, his hand resting on his gun butt. The 2 cavalry soldiers flanked him, looking uncomfortable but determined. The other men spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off any escape routes. "Well, well," Bull sneered. "Look what we got here. The famous Deadeye Thorn consorting with savages. Didn't think you could sink any lower, but I was wrong." "This doesn't concern you, Bull," I said, my voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even me. "This is between me and my conscience." "Oh, but it does concern me." Bull's grin was ugly. See, after you crawled out of my saloon like the coward you are, I got to thinking, a man like you, with your reputation, you might just be desperate enough to do something stupid, like selling information to the Apache, or maybe planning some kind of revenge against the town that rejected you. One of the soldiers stepped forward. Sergeant Mills, 4th Cavalry, he announced formally. Mr. Patterson here has made some serious accusations, Thorne. Says you've been conspiring with hostiles. That's a lie, I said flatly. But even if it were true, what business is it of yours? Everything's our business when it comes to Apache, Mills replied. There's been talk of another uprising. Washington's nervous. Any white man found collaborating with potential hostiles is considered a traitor. I could see where this was heading. Bull had found a way to destroy me completely, not just my reputation, but my life. By painting me as a traitor, he could justify anything that happened next. You want to know about traitors, Sergeant? I said, my hand moving slowly toward my gun. Let me tell you about the real traitors, the ones who massacre innocent people and call it duty. Bull's eyes widened with understanding. You're talking about Fort Apache, aren't you? I heard stories about that. How you went soft, couldn't finish the job. I went human, I corrected, something you wouldn't understand. That's when Ayanna stepped out of the cabin behind me. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The soldiers raised their rifles, Bull's companions drew their weapons, and the tension in the clearing ratcheted up to a breaking point. "Stay back!" Sergeant Mills barked. "The Apache woman, you're under arrest for conspiracy against the United States." "On what evidence?" I demanded, stepping protectively in front of Ayanna. "The evidence of her being here with you," Bull laughed. "That's all the evidence we need." I could feel Ayanna's presence behind me, could sense her preparing to run or fight, but I also knew that neither option would save us. There were too many of them, and they had already decided our guilt. "You want me, Bull?" I called out. "Then face me, just you and me. Winner takes all." "You think I'm stupid enough to give you a fair fight?" Bull scoffed. "You're washed up, Thorne. Can't even hold your own gun steady. Then what are you afraid of?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Bull's face reddened, and I could see his pride warring with his caution. The other men were watching, waiting to see if he would back down from a washed-up gunfighter. "Fine," he growled. "But when I kill you, the squaw comes with us. She'll hang for treason right alongside your memory. And if I win, you won't." "Aight." But as Bull moved into position for the draw, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity, purpose. For the first time since that terrible day 7 years ago, I knew exactly why I was fighting. Not for my reputation, not for my pride, but for the woman behind me who had shown me that redemption was possible. For the memory of her husband, who had died believing that good men still existed. For the chance to finally do something right. "On 3, Sergeant Mills called out reluctantly. 1. I thought about the little girl I couldn't kill, about the forgiveness I'd never sought, about the second chance I'd been given. 2. My hand was steady as stone. The tremor that had plagued me for months was gone, replaced by something I'd thought I'd lost forever, purpose. 3. Both guns cleared leather simultaneously, but for the first time in over a year, mine cleared faster. The shot echoed across the clearing like thunder. Bull Patterson staggered backward, his own gun firing harmlessly into the dirt as he fell. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Sergeant Mills slowly lowered his rifle. "Jesus," one of Bull's companions whispered. "He really was Deadeye Thorne." But I barely heard them. I was turning toward Ayanna, seeing the mixture of relief and wonder in her eyes, when everything changed again. "You killed him," she said softly. "For me." "No," I replied, holstering my gun. "For us. For the chance to become the man your husband thought I could be." Sergeant Mills stepped forward, his expression uncertain. "Thorne, we still have our orders." "Your orders were based on lies," I said firmly. "This woman is no threat to anyone. She's been living peacefully for 3 years, harming no one. As for me, I'm done running from my past. If you want to arrest me for what happened at Fort Apache, do it. but leave her out of it." The sergeant looked from me to Ayanna, then back again. Finally, he shook his head. "Patterson brought us here under false pretenses. Without his testimony, we've got no evidence of wrongdoing. As far as I'm concerned, this was a case of self-defense." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We're heading back to the fort." As the soldiers rode away, I found myself alone with Ayanna in the sudden quiet of the morning. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What happens now?" she asked. I thought about it for a long moment. "Now we decide who we want to be. Together." She smiled then. The first real smile I'd seen from her. "I would like that very much, Ezra Thorne. But I should warn you, life with me will not be easy. The world is not kind to couples like us." "I've never been one to choose the easy path," I said, taking her hand in mine. "Besides, I figure if we can survive everything that brought us to this point, we can probably survive anything." 6 months later, we were married by a circuit preacher in a town 200 miles from Tombstone. I'd sold my gun and bought a small ranch where we raise horses and cattle. Ayanna teaches me Apache customs while I teach her about ranching. Some folks don't approve of our union, but most have learned to respect what we've built together. I still think about that night in the storm, about how close I came to dying alone and forgotten. But I also think about second chances, about redemption, and about how sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. My name is Ezra Thorne, and this is the story of how I learned that a man's past doesn't have to define his future. All it takes is the courage to face your demons and the wisdom to accept help when it's offered, even from those you've been taught to fear, especially from those you've been taught to fear.